If places are spaces invested with cultural meaning, then it follows that the mass depopulation resulting from the spread of 28 Days Later's rage virus ensures that there are vastly fewer uninfected people present within the city, and therefore any cultural values that have been suffused into particular elements of the built environment have ceased to be held in place precisely because those cultural values need to be recapitulated by a populace. Edward Ralph states that if places are indeed a fundamental aspect of man's existence in the world, if they are sources of security and identity for individuals and for groups of people, then it is important that the means of experiencing, creating, and maintaining significant places are not lost. Whilst the country's population has not been entirely decimated within Boyle's post-viral landscape, the few uninfected survivors the film offers expend their energies finding shelter and food and avoiding infection. Understandably, reiterating the meaning of particular spaces is no longer important in such circumstances. Undoubtedly, there are elements within the city that still evoke some remnants of their cultural status. The Palace of Westminster is still the Palace of Westminster, but in such culturally reduced conditions, it's only nominally so. Essentially, the post-viral landscape is one in which the act of maintaining significant places has become difficult, to say the least, because the larger structures of socialization that required places to have symbolic value have ceased to exist. Edward Krupa suggests that the built environment can be thought of as relating to people in each of 5 ways, and one of these ways he describes as being cognitive. He explains his use of the term as such: the city as a whole and each of its component parts, from large to small, speak to people. They provide cues to behaviour, i.e. what is appropriate, how best to accomplish one's goals, and these are the intended meanings of design. It's this overarching cohesion built into the environment, as Krupat suggests, that is lost to the upheaval of mass infection. This is in part the result of mass depopulation, but partly because the majority of people left in the city are infected. Given how transmissible rage is, it's to be assumed that the infected hugely outnumber the uninfected. Whilst the uninfected survivors have a set of concerns that ensure the reiteration of cognitive spatial meanings are far less important than those immediate concerns, the infected have even less inclination to acknowledge the pre-viral meanings that are physically and cognitively built into the environment. In fact, it would be more accurate to suggest that the infected have absolutely no awareness of cognitive spatial ideas, reduced as they are to the condition of experiencing only the singular biological and cognitive imperative of expressing rage. Their engagement with space is simplified to the simple criteria that involves avoiding open spaces during the day because they have an apparent aversion to light, and occupying spaces that indicate the presence of uninfected people. The primary concerns for those who have escaped infection are to remain uninfected and to find sources of shelter and food that will enable them to avoid moving around spaces that may bring them into contact with the infected. However, particular characters within the film do demonstrate definite inclinations towards retaining cognitive ideas of space, and especially spaces such as the home that infer upon them facets of what Ralph calls security and identity. Despite the tumultuous circumstances that the uninfected survivors find themselves in, it's important to preserve a sense of personal identity. Ralph suggests that the person who has no place with which he identifies is in effect homeless, without roots. And because identity is unavoidably tied to meaningful spaces, the loss of such spaces entails a corresponding loss of identity. During his exploration of London streets, Jim meets a pair of survivors, Selena and Mark, who save him from a group of the infected and take him to their shelter, a newsagent's stall in the London Underground. Whilst Jim was spared the experience of watching the collapse of society, Selina and Mark have been exposed to its full dissolution. As such, they're understandably more cautious than Jim and even regard his reaction to events with sardonic cynicism. Selina and Mark's reasons for saving Jim's life are never explained outside of the fact that he's the first uninfected person that they've seen for 6 days. They're clearly managing to survive adequately, and so it's probable that in such circumstances, Jim's humanity is reason enough for him to be rescued and included within their group. Indeed, one of the film's most endearing narrative points is the way in which Jim is able to rehumanize Selina, who, when he first encounters her, is emotionally detached and methodical in her self-preservation. If meaningful places are lost, then the need for the relationships that maintain identity and humanity become even more important. Meaningful places are not, however, immediately and universally abandoned in either physical or cognitive terms. After being taken to the newsagent stall that serves as Selina and Mark's shelter, Jim is given a brief account of the events that decimated the population. Understandably, his thoughts turn to his parents, and he's nonchalantly told that they will be dead, like Mark's and Selina's families. The three travel the next day to Jim's family home, where he does indeed find his parents are dead. They've taken overdoses, and Selina tells Jim that he should be grateful for this relatively peaceful end, given it was completely on their own terms and didn't result either from infection or at the hands of the infected. It's entirely explicable that Jim should have such a strong desire to return to his home, given that Ralph describes it as the point of departure from which we orient ourselves and take possession of the world, and that having roots in a place is to have a secure point from which to look out on the world, a firm grasp of one's own position in the order of things, and a significant spiritual and psychological attachment to somewhere in particular. Jim has so far been unable to locate himself in the world that he's been thrust into. In fact, he's barely had a chance to take stock of that world. So his pilgrimage to his family home, his secure point, is as much an attempt to reposition himself as it is an inquiry into the status of his parents. Whilst Jim must confront the fact that his parents are dead, he does attempt to centre himself within the space of his home, and he does this largely through acts of memory that allow him to retreat into a cognitive space in which his parents are alive and the virus has not ravaged the city. In a sense, Jim's parents have followed the very same logic. When he finds their bodies, his mother is clutching a photograph of Jim as a child, and written on the back are the words, "Jim, with endless love, we left you sleeping. Now we're sleeping with you. Don't wake up." They've chosen to end their lives whilst being locked into an emotional and cognitive state that reunites their family in the space of the home. Similarly, as Mark and Selina sleep, Jim lights a candle and allows the space of the kitchen to evoke memories of his parents, rendered on screen in a visually degraded manner that's reminiscent of VHS or even Super 8 home video footage, as though he's replaying a moment that was recorded because of its significance. Jim remembers his mother returning home with groceries, and as his father speaks to Jim within the reminiscence, Jim answers in the present, suggesting he's entirely immersed in this clearly contented cognitive space. This internal process maintains the meaning of the home and prevents it from simply being an empty house. The importance of such spatial reiterations are described by Tim Cresswell as such. Place is a kind of necessary social construction, something we have to construct in order to be human. Given how fragmented Jim's sense of personal identity is, this is clearly a necessary moment of reconstruction. However, the candle that Jim lights attracts the attention of a couple of the infected, who burst through the kitchen's patio doors and skylight. Whilst Mark and Selina are awoken by the commotion and fight off the infected, Jim's idyllic moment is shattered, as is the serenity and cognitive security of his family home. Maria Balshaw and Liam Kennedy suggest that even as place provides a point of settlement and definition, its contours remain contested and porous, and so effective responses to place often make it the locus of struggles over representational rights. It would be greatly understating the situation to suggest that there's a struggle to locate a representational position within the space of the post-viral city. But even given the fact that the uninfected population is vastly reduced and face a constant threat of attack from the roaming infected, there are still some attempts to invest space with meaning. As the above example demonstrates, though, these attempts are contested by the presence of the infected, who disrupt spatial meanings and yet are incapable of inferring upon space any meanings of their own. In the case of Jim's home, the infected not only physically threaten the safety of Jim's group, but they ensure the space can no longer be the site of Jim's retreat into a familiar cognitive moment. Where Jim attempts to momentarily retreat into a cognitive space of domestic comfort in order to recenter himself, there's an even more explicit example of this sort of spatial struggle for representation rights later in the film, when Jim and Selena encounter another pair of survivors. During the attack on Jim's home by the infected, Mark sustains a deep cut on his arm that is presumably infected by the blood spatters resulting from the fight. Upon seeing the gash on his arm, Selena doesn't risk waiting to see if Mark is indeed infected and proceeds to kill him with a machete. This act both reinforces the idea that the virus is incredibly contagious and anyone suspected of infection needs to be dealt with immediately, and further illustrates how contestable both spaces and relationships have become. Selena has been surviving with Mark for at least 6 days, and yet her killing of him demonstrates her emotional detachment from such units of familiarity. This form of behaviour is, Dahlia Schweitzer suggests, a prevailing characteristic of outbreak narratives, where the fear of infection makes one especially aware of the distance between bodies, making a suspected carrier feel uncomfortably close. The act of separating out the infected body from the uninfected space clearly has a biologically sound logic, but the infected also carry the threat of spatial disruption. Their presence within space renders that space no longer fit for cognitive investment. After leaving Jim's family home, he and Selena walk through London, and through the grey mass of the built environment, they see a window in a tower block that's framed by flashing fairy lights. They correctly assume this is a sign of life and move towards it. The architect of the beacon is Frank, a taxi driver who lives in the building with his daughter Hannah. Jim and Selena's introduction to Frank happens during one of the film's most adrenalized scenes, in which the pair is ascending the tower's staircase when they hear some infected enter the building. The scene becomes a race against time as the pair, and especially Jim, struggle through fatigue to make it up the staircase, where they're confronted by Frank wearing police riot gear. He allows them into the entrance to his floor before brutally dispatching with the oncoming infected. Jim and Selena investigate the apparent sign of life because more people increase the chance of survival, and Frank has set up this beacon with that in mind. Schweitzer states that barriers are another repeated visual trope in the outbreak narrative. They can be tangible, as in masks or protective gear, or metal doors to block out dangerous microbes, or they can be political, as with quarantine regulations, travel restrictions, or border policies. Frank has created physical barriers that hinder the possibility of the infected reaching his flat. Firstly, he's placed a large number of shopping trolleys at the entrance to the building staircase that both slow down the progress of any infected and alert him to their presence. Secondly, he stands at the entrance to his floor and repels any infected using a police riot shield and an iron bar. This physically enforced border effectively separates out the threatening world beyond the flat and the security and cognitive familiarity of the domestic space within. The normality found within Frank's flat is jarring, as is his own demeanour once he sheds his body armour and visor, because it's so welcoming and gentle in comparison to the brutal behaviour he demonstrates against the infected. Undoubtedly, the retention of a warm domestic ambience is facilitated by the fact that Frank and Hannah are a familial unit. Whilst the tower block is abandoned and derelict, and the physical borders that Frank has constructed ensure it is unwelcoming, the flat itself is a space filled with cognitive investment because, as Ralph states, being lived in confers some authenticity on even the most trivial and unrelentingly uniform landscape. Such places are rarities and even luxuries in an environment that's become threatening and devoid of spatial and cognitive cohesion. Peter Hutchings argues that within the abandoned landscape, emptied as it is of the potential for individual and social agency, there's the possibility of subjects regressing to something less than human. It's arguable that Selina, when Jim first meets her, has allowed her humanity to recede and instead relies on a pragmatic and ruthless sense of personal identity, trait she allows to surface in order to better her chances of survival. This contrasts greatly with the relationship between Frank and Hannah, partly because Selina doesn't have access to a space that's secure enough to invest with cognitive meaning. Frank's home retains its cultural values through both the continuation of the family unit and the recapitulation of memories. The fairy lights and the fact that the initial scenes within the flat are accompanied by the tune Frosty the Snowman reinforces a sense of familial warmth. The flat is filled with family photographs, and when Frank wants to offer Jim and Selina a drink, Anna suggests her mum's creme de menthe. Clearly then, this space is invested with family values and memories that facilitate the continuation of their humanity. Whilst the flat itself is a sentimental space containing associations with Frank's life before the virus, it's place rather than merely space, precisely because it's the location in which the father-daughter relationship is maintained. Jim finds this relationship endearing, telling Selina that he thinks they're good people, in all likelihood a recognition of their humanity. Her cynical response is, well, that's nice, but you should be more concerned about whether they're going to slow you down. Whilst Frank's home is an environment that allows for the retention of the family unit in cognitive and emotional terms, he confides in Jim that it can't physically sustain him and Anna. The act of signalling with fairy lights is then an attempt to find suitable travelling companions rather than to attract more people for his domestic unit. Kyle William Bishop, referring to I Am Legend, suggests that Robert Neville's house is not only a refuge and a source of comfort and familiarity. The converted home unfortunately ties him down to one place and requires considerable attention and upkeep. This is true of Frank and Hannah's flat, as is Bishop's further argument that rather than roaming across the country in search of other survivors, Neville must stay close to home. Furthermore, he cannot let go of the lost past that the house represents. Whilst Frank is indeed emotionally tied to his home and the memories it contains, it's his status as father, a status that's symbiotically linked to the home, that prevents him from becoming mobile. Frank explicitly states that he and Hannah can no longer stay in the building, given there's no water supply and there's been no rain to fill the numerous receptacles he's placed on the building's roof. In addition, he suggests that if he and Hannah left the building in search of other survivors, something might happen to him and his daughter will be left to fend for herself. Undoubtedly, if the flat had a source of fresh water, Frank would be more inclined to remain in the space that contains so many cognitive elements, memories of his wife, for example. Like Neville, Frank's stronghold requires a significant physical investment, given he needs to voraciously defend it, placing his own uninfected status at hazard. Unlike Neville, though, Frank doesn't believe that he and Hannah are the last uninfected people alive. He has a radio and he's found a transmission being broadcast from a squadron of soldiers near Manchester who claim to have the answer to infection. Just as Selina recognised the need for others for the purposes of protection and the confirmation of her own humanity, so too does Frank understand that he must relinquish his domestic space in order to improve the chances of survival for his daughter.